Welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews in partnership with Roadrunner Sports, and today we're taking a look at two very popular daily trainers from New Balance. It's the 1080 V14 and the More V5. Let's run with it. Before we get started, I do want to say these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, no one had a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. I'd also like to say please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. Here we go. Now, the reason we're taking a look at these two shoes in particular is the 1080 V14, which just came out, got some small tweaks to it compared to its predecessor, is New Balance's do-it-all flagship premium daily trainer with one of the softest underfoot experiences in the game with this Fresh Foam X midsole. And then the More V5, as the name pretty much implies, is just the larger version because it has more foam than the 1080. Both shoes use Fresh Foam X, so if you're someone who likes the 1080 but just wants more cushioning, that's where the More comes in. And if you've tried the More and need something a bit more manageable, that is where the 1080 comes in. So it really is the smaller shoe and the larger shoe with a similar kind of setup because they have the same kind of foam, at least on paper, and a very, very similar upper experience. So I'm going to give you what my thoughts are and kind of explain the key differences between them other than just the More being the larger shoe. Funny enough, the More is the cheaper shoe at $155, while the 1080 has a slightly more premium price tag of $165. Another thing that's kind of funny is these shoes weigh almost the same. The More is heavier compared to the 1080. It comes in at 10.7 ounces, while the 1080 comes in at 10.5, which is somewhat heavy for this category. So they are pretty much within striking distance of each other when it comes to weight, and the 1080 did gain a decent amount compared to its prior version. As far as the stack height goes, you have about 5 more millimeters in the More, with about 43 in the heel and 39 in the forefoot for a 4 millimeter drop. And then on the 1080, we have 38 in the heel and 32 in the forefoot for a 6 millimeter drop. So a slightly higher drop in the 1080 compared to the More with its lower 4 millimeter drop. Moving on to the uppers, both shoes did fit true to size for me, and I'm very happy to report that the 1080 did become more accommodating, especially in the toe box. I found that V13, the previous model, was rather narrow in the toe box, kind of pushed my toes together, and while this is not the widest toe box, it is definitely wider than the prior version. And while I do think this does have plenty of room and is fairly comfortable, I do think the More has just even a slight bit more volume through the midfoot and toe box. Again, both shoes fit true to size, and I really like the overall fit and comfort of both of these uppers, but I do think just a bit more volume exists in the More V5. Now, something that's maybe not as obvious when you look at these shoes is I do think the 1080 is more breathable, despite having what it looks to be a similar kind of engineered mesh or mesh material. Now, the reason for that is the tongue is essentially fully gusseted on the More, where there's this internal liner of fabric. So you have two layers, the outer layer and an internal fabric liner, where that does not exist on the 1080. The 1080 just has the outer layer of mesh, and then the tongue is gusseted, just strips of engineered mesh on both sides, and there's no internal liner like we see with the More. So the More has 2 layers of fabric between your foot and the outside air, and the 1080 only has 1 layer, which is just the layer you see on the outside of the upper. So a slight edge to the 1080 when it comes to the overall breathability. Like I mentioned before, both tongues are gusseted. However, there is a bit more padding on the More compared to the 1080. It doesn't make a massive difference, but just feels ever so slightly more plush. And then if we go to the rear of the shoe, the ankle and Achilles sections feel almost identical, same levels of padding, and the heel counters themselves about have the same level of rigidity. Both midsoles are technically Fresh Foam X, at least on paper, and New Balance on both of these shoes on the insert has this little timeline that shows you the evolution of Fresh Foam X. And according to these timelines that I see inside the shoes here, both the 1080 and the More had the same generation of Fresh Foam X. However, in my opinion at least, I don't think they feel necessarily identical, and that's one partially because the More has 5 more millimeters of stack height and a lower drop, giving you even more foam underneath your forefoot. And I do think because the shoes weigh roughly the same, you have a slightly less dense midsole foam here. I would expect the shoe to weigh much more because it has even more midsole foam. So I'm assuming that the foam we see on the 1080 is going to be a little bit more dense. And in my experience, I think that kind of plays out. For me, the 1080 had a slightly more stable and slightly more springy experience compared to the More, which was for me kind of mostly focused on being soft, squishy, and plush. Something I do want to point out is I do think that the 1080 V14 is a touch firmer and has a touch less energy return compared to the 1080 V13 or the prior model. Now, what does that do? Well, I think that makes the shoe ever so slightly more stable. It just gives you a bit more guidance. Now, I will say I don't think that the 1080 or the more, either of these current models, are the most stable neutral options out there, mainly because these are some of the softest midsoles around for their respective categories. And if you're someone who needs just a little bit of guidance or wants a slightly more stable neutral shoe, I don't know if I would necessarily recommend these two particular options. However, in my opinion, these are some of the most comfortable midsoles right now. They don't have the most amount of energy return. I think, like I've said, other reviews about New Balance Fresh Foam X, you might want to go to something like the Fuel Cell line. For me, that does have a little bit more pop to it. But while this does have a touch of energy return, this is probably one of the softest and most comfortable platforms, especially for the New Balance lineup. When it comes to the overall performance, these two trainers behave very differently. Now, I really like what New Balance is doing with the 1080 V14, just mainly because of this midsole foam compound. And while it's not perfect, I do think it kind of stands out from the rest of all the other neutral trainers out there. Now, as far as the negatives go, it's a little bit heavy at 10.5 ounces. It's not that light. And while it does have a wide range of runs available to it, I think it struggles at the top end or on those faster runs. It really does its best work and kind of those slower to medium paced efforts. Yes, you can push the pace. I just think there's some more aggressive all around daily trainers out there. Now, this Fresh Foam X, I think, just gives you a very nice plush ride without being too mushy. It doesn't feel like I'm working through this midsole. It does a good job of kind of getting you out and going, and that's partially because of the vertical rubber coverage at the front of the shoe, the rocker geometry, and just the nature of this Fresh Foam X. Again, not overly soft, doesn't feel like I'm fighting through the midsole, doesn't feel like I'm bottoming it out either, which is sometimes the case when I have a shoe as soft as this. It doesn't feel like I'm kind of getting all the way to the ground. You have a nice level of squish and a small bit of energy return. Again, I think they toned it back just a bit compared to the prior version. And then if we're talking about the More V5, this thing actually doesn't weigh that much more compared to the 1080. However, it is significantly softer with 5 more millimeters of stack height and a lower 4 millimeter drop compared to the 6 millimeter drop we see with the 1080, which means you're gonna have even more foam under your forefoot. So if you like a lot more squish and plushness towards the top of the shoe, I think the More is going to be your friend. Now, this is also a much bulkier option as well. When you line these two shoes up, you'll notice that the midsole on the More is just massive. This thing is a large running shoe. I kind of classify this as like an Ultra Max cushion option. The midsole compression here is quite substantial. You have a lot of squish. It's not the most energetic large running shoe I've used, but it's, I think, more focused on cushioning rather than kind of spraying or just overall resiliency. Now, this thing for me works really well for easier recovery days, and I think is kind of more squared towards slower runs. It's not as versatile compared to the 1080, which I do think has a wider range of options available to it, and it would probably be my go-to if I had to pick between these two options. However, for someone who wants the most amount of comfort, even for just walking, I think that is where the 1080 really shines through. Well, that concludes the review. Let me know in the comments what you think, or which shoe would you rather go with. I would love to hear from you. I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.